So last week, we did this, what I considered the central section for understanding. There were two images that were there. Remember what they were? First of all, there was a lamb. What happened with the lamb? Appears very weak when they're looking for strength. But who's the only one worthy?
The lamb.
Who's the only one that fixes it all?
The lamb.
Yeah, that's what you have to remember about this whole thing. It's not the great and the powerful. It is the lamb that fixes. That's key to understanding all of it. It's going to be key to this section. Second thing, how many people make it out of this whole thing? Sometimes called the time of tribulation or the great ordeal. I mean, plus
Everybody.
a great multitude that no one can count. So a whole bunch of people. All right, you have to remember those two things because typically people do the opposite of those two words. They say it's a small number, and they say it's because you have more power and might than. And that neither one of those is the right narrative. That's important because this section is a tough section. Because it feels a lot like what we just went through. We opened up 6 seals, and what happened under each one of the seals? Something you hope never happens.
Yeah.
Right? All kinds of stuff that was horrible and terrible. And when we get to the 7th seal here, before the 7th seal opens, suddenly you're going to hear a section that sounds like that section, but even worse. Okay? And you're going to say, you're going to want to say, wait a second. It helps to remember the name of this class. Do you know what the name of the class is? It's the end of
the world.
No, it's and I feel fine. Remember that REM song?
Oh, yeah.
End of the world as you know it. Everything's going differently than what you know. And the response is, I feel fine. Now, why is it that we don't typically feel fine when everything's falling apart?
Because it's painful.
It's painful. What else?
You feel like we lost control.
Lost control. What else?
It's a mystery of what's coming.
It's a mystery. And it feels like not only is it a mystery, but it feels like you're not sure if you want what's coming. Right? It feels like it's all just negative going down that road. And so you sit in this space of relative impotence with everything going in directions that you don't want to do and you can't control at all. And what Revelation is saying, what John the Revelator says is, be fine. I feel fine. Don't worry. Don't complain. Don't get angry. Be fine. Now, how he means that is a little bit different than what we might mean. So instead of reading first today, before we read what you're not going to want to listen to, I want to explain what it means. So that you listen to it with different ears than what you're going to want to listen to. Okay, so there's 7 trumpet blasts. 3 of them are called the woes. Whoa, whoa, whoa. How many like whoa, whoa, whoa? None of us do.
Now, wait, in those songs from the 1950s, whoa, whoa, whoa was pretty good.
Okay. The first 4 trumpets are pretty bad even before you get to the woes. But just know that it sounds really bad. And you're going to want to say, wait a second, what does this have to do with God? But you have to hear what happens right at the beginning. We're about to open the 7th seal out of 7. And what's the number 7 mean? God, perfection. That everything's going right. 7 seals. Then you're going to hear 7 trumpet blasts. And every one of those blasts sounds like anything but God, anything but perfection. Okay? But it's 7. So what's it mean? God. God present, God active, God in control. Doesn't feel like it when you're in a place like this, what we're going to describe here. But just before it happens, just before they open that seventh seal, silence happens. For half an hour, it says, silence in heavens. And then they take the censer, remember they talk about that in the lampstand, and they bring it out and they burn the prayers. They lift up this, then burn the incense along with the prayers of those who have been damaged so far. Those 144,000 and a great multitude. All those prayers are lifted up. And then the thunder begins. Eugene Peterson wrote a book, an amazing book on this. And it's called Reversed Thunder. And he takes it from this particular section. I don't know if you know Eugene Peterson, he's the one who wrote the Message Bible. He's also a great poet, did most of his work in books like the Psalms and Proverbs, those poetic books of the Bible. And he looks at this in the same way, from a poet's point of view. And he says, what this is saying is very different. He quotes another man who calls it reversed thunder. That as thunder comes, these prayers reverse the thunder and send it in a very different way. So when you hear the thunder that's going to happen as the trumpets are blowing, remember that it's not talking about the evil down there, but the work that God is doing. The trumpet blasts are not that stuff over there. It's what God does. It's key, because it's really easy to see all this stuff we're going to read as all the evil that Shar brings on, all the evil that Joe brings on, all the stuff that you guys do that the rest of us don't like. Okay? All of that, but you'll see it's much more personified than that. But it is the first four things are all natural. You're exactly right. But this is saying who's in charge of all this, and all these thunders of these trumpets are God at work. Why do you blow a trumpet usually? What are the reasons why you might blow a trumpet? Think about this in the ancient world. Announcements. That's exactly right. What else?
To get one's attention.
To get one's attention.
To start an attack.
To start an attack. Very often in the ancient world, especially, the trumpet was the one who said, come on, army, let's go. And so I think that very often people read this with that, let's charge into battle. The bugle, blowing and calling us to move. But the most typical way that a trumpet was used was exactly those kinds of things you said. To say, I got something coming that's important. You need to hear this. You need to listen to this.
Or
And
attacks.
what?
Or attacks.
Or attack. Yeah. And are you hearing it that way? Or are you busy pulling out your sword ready to slice the enemy? Now, ancient people would have known the difference between one type of trumpet blast and another type of trumpet blast. We really haven't used trumpets for that for decades, maybe even centuries in most cases, right? Back in the Civil War, we did use them that way. Since the Civil War, we've increasingly not used them that way. But they used to be a very important part of the war, but a very important part of bringing people together. Because they're clear. It's easy to hear a trumpet from a long way away. And so when the trumpet sounds, it means come. And if you remember when we were in last week's stuff, that word come was really important. The angels each said, come, and told us to move towards. And we forget that, don't we? Okay. Sorry that this is not the easiest part of all of this to listen to. But sit and rest and hear what it's saying. and try to hear what I just told you, so that you hear this differently than what your ears are gonna wanna hear it. Your mind is gonna wanna interpret it, or your heart is gonna want to understand it. Try to hear it through the lenses of what we already have, through a lamb and 144,000 plus a great multitude. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets made ready to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the stars were struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars. I must have said that wrong. A third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light was darkened. A third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. Then I looked, and I heard an earth eagles crying with a loud voice that flew in mid-heaven. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth. And he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the earth were darkened, and the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given authority like the authority of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth, which, by the way, isn't there any longer because it got burnt off in the first time, remember? Sorry, book's not perfect. I want to point that out. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green growth on any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their forehead. They were allowed to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it, for they will long to die, but death will flee from them. In appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots, with horses rushing into battle. They have tails like scorpions with stingers, and in their tails is their power to harm people for 5 months. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon. The first woe has passed. There are still 2 woes to come. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the trumpet. I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the 4 angels were released, who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year to kill a third of humankind. The number of the troops of cavalry were 200 million. I heard their number, and this was how I saw the horses in my vision. The riders wore breastplates of the color of fire and of sapphire, and of sulfur. The heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouth. By these three plagues, a third of humankind was killed by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses in their mouth and in their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they inflict harm. The rest of humanity were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, or give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorcery, or their fornication, or their thefts. How many like that?
That sounds like nuclear holocaust.
It sounds like nuclear holocaust. But here's the thing. This is in contrast to the first section that we read last week, where all those things happened, and who was causing that? Or better said, who's causing this? What is all this being caused by? No? Good guess, though.
Well, one interpretation is it's being caused by the extreme repressed anger of John or whoever dictated this.
God. Very clear. All these things are coming from the angels who listen completely to God. Now, in the larger picture, we're looking literally. We say, why is John, who's sitting in Patmos alone and solitaire and without anyone around him, without any ability to talk or do anything, why would he write something like this? That's where the repressed anger seems to come from. He's trying to say, what will solve this? What will change this? Eugene Peterson says it's the key to this is the first few words I read. That the incense was put into the censer along with the prayers of the saints. The prayers of those who had been martyred, like 144,000. The prayers of those who are trying to touch and connect with God. And this is the answer, that your prayers are not, do not go away. They're not of no avail. Things happen. God is in charge. And it's bigger than. Here's the bad part is that people don't like to say that's God. Because a third of the people of the earth, all the grass, a third of the animals, a third of the waters, all the rivers are made bitter and unusable, right? Does that sound like the God you want? And so you know what we do? We typically assign it to somebody besides God. So we take Abaddon or Apollyon, and we say, oh, that's a personification of evil, because it comes from the bottomless pit. But who brings it from there? The voice of good, the voice of God. So I think we're misinterpreting what bottomless pit means. Because God is drawing from there. And the God image is mad at something, right? It's destroying the world. It's destroying earth. It's destroying people. And what's he mad about? The key was in the last little bit that we talked about, that I read. Want to hear it again?
Do not repent of their murder.
That's right. The rest of humankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, or give up worshiping demons or idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorcery or their fornication or their thefts. People don't listen. And to be truthful, I don't listen on a regular basis to things like my mom. my teachers, my bishop. I do relatively selfish, relatively self-centered, relatively what I think is right type of things. Am I listening to the voice of God?
It sounds pretty human.
It sounds pretty human, it's exactly right. That's what it's saying. Humanity doesn't listen well to God. Even if there were plagues that brought all of this stuff, I mean, those locusts, I mean, want to meet one of those. Yeah, and don't you think that if you met them, I mean, you want to think that your response would be, all right, got my attention, God, I'll start listening now. And what's our response? What happens to the rest of humanity? We don't listen. And worse than that, in our day, we begin assigning that to something else, to somebody else. We begin to assign that to evil, right? And so we have to fight against that in some way or another. But who sent all this? God sent it all. And if you fight against it, who are you fighting against? God. You see how we turn it and do the exact opposite? We say, we've got to fight that because it seems so bad towards me, instead of acknowledging God present in all of that. Now I get that that doesn't describe a good God. Doesn't describe the type of God we want. That's not what the point is. The point is, no matter what happens, are you going to see God present in it? Or are you going to fight against everything? Now, what is it that you like to fight against that doesn't feel like God to you?
I'm still gonna keep fighting against that.
But that's what I want you to do. I want you to tell me, what are the types of things you like fighting
Right
against?
now,
Yeah,
Republican.
Republicans.
I mean, not for me necessarily, but that is like.
Yeah, that feels like the evil, the locust that you're supposed to fight. I get that.
But, and I wouldn't say, but, and then it's the reverse. I mean, they would see us.
As
As the evil.
exactly right. That's exactly
And I don't
right.
mean Republican.
No, we get exactly what you mean, and if I was in a conservative congregation right now, they would say, who are the locusts? It's you guys, you're exactly right, right? The Russians, Putin, everything that's happening there.
Every time we move into fear, which those catastrophes turn into, my hearing shuts off. And then I need something. Like,
Yeah.
so that's a doctor's. Feels like an automatic response.
It does feel like an automatic response.
The fear? I'm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the shutdown of the hearing. I'm not aware that I've shut down the hearing. But in listening to that, I think that's what happens. That, you know, when I'm faced with something catastrophic like that, I go into fear, and once I'm in fear, then I don't hear anything.
Yeah.
I don't hear hope, I don't hear liberation, I don't hear anything, I'm just stuck in fear.
All we see is the destruction of, that fear seems to be causing, the loss of, the difficulty of. Right?
I'm gonna play the heretic here. If God is in control of everything, why would God want to cause all this suffering? So
Okay.
my thought is, it's not the intelligence of the universe that is wanting to cause all the suffering. It's those of us who are not hearing the way that things could be, and so we cause it. Wow.
It's not who causes it, that's not the point here.
You keep saying who causes it, it's God. I don't see the
Yeah.
point, why?
Because here's why. This is not a theological piece.
Why?
This is not a theological piece. And what you're arguing is a theological point. You're saying that's not what God's like. That's not how God works. That's not what this point, that's not what the point is here. It's the point you're making. How is our response to this type of thing? What's it supposed to be? How do we respond?
Like
If
the
it's
map.
not a theological piece, then how would you describe it?
I think it's a worship piece. I think it's an imaginative piece, and it's trying to say, how are you going to live in the space of if this happened? Now, part of what you have to remember is what it is that most of first century or early second century Christians were facing. They were in a space where most of the powers that be were against them. Most of them lived in a space where there were arms raised against them. Some of them were hiding in spaces so that they were never found out, because it might be their life, it might be their livelihood, it might be their family that gets lost. Okay? And this whole piece is about saying, how do you imaginatively look at that difficult, challenging world and live differently than what happens with that?
So the way I see it is we're basically being told, and you know, the background you just gave is relevant, but it's basically it's a very black and white world, because the Christians are having to present themselves they have having to take huge risks to follow their faith. They're having to do very brave things that we're not called upon. And the cruelty of the revenge against them is hideous. And this to me is just like a fantasy of revenge on all the killing and destruction that's happening against the Christians.
Yeah. And it's stated in this way. I would say, yes, you're right, but that's not the point. The point is, God is in charge. So whatever happens, however it happens, if it feels like it's a Roman soldier with that sword against your neck, still believe what's the truth, that God is in charge. Walk faithful in that moment. And what's difficult about that is it feels like it's just God's going to get them someday. But that's not the point. That's not what it's trying to say here. It's saying that whatever it is that they caused, God could do worse. God is more powerful than that. How are you going to live in the midst of it? It's not even saying that. What we try to do with this is we try to set it and say it means it's a certain thing that happens. What we look at this as being is we try to give it definitive answers. Oh, that was Nero, or that was this event in Roman history. And we try to set it that way, and it's never that. It's an imaginative piece that says, in the midst of whatever happens, how are you going to act? What are you going to do? What helps? What doesn't help? What is the appropriate faithfulness and what is not? Okay? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think what's hard in this is that to recognize this as a recognizable genre of writing for those times. Just like our genre of fantasy, science fiction, that
Yeah,
make the argument more towards fantasy.
I do.
And those who are, if you're a fantasy fan, you don't think that's real. You're not watching that, show Rings of Power, whatever you're watching, you're not gonna, oh, this is real. You know how to interpret that, the archetypes, the language, the Christians of that time knew what those numbers meant. Knew what those symbols were. And it, to me, use the word worship piece. To me, it was like a theater, it seems very theatrical.
Which, what I believe most of worship was developed to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so the doing of communion, for example, are we truly feeding each other in that? No, we're doing the theatrical piece that says, in this you feed, in this you eat, in this God is present. Right, that's a theatrical piece. And it's telling a deeper meaning that isn't meant to be interpreted literally, but figuratively and symbolically, and supposed to move you into a different living than without that. So what is this calling us to live? When you read all of this disaster, what's it calling you to do?
Well, I really have trouble relating to it because I have a real different view of science.
I know that.
And that we have all this free will that just is, and that God doesn't. So for me, part of this just seems like someone having a psychotic episode.
Yeah, that's all I think.
And they're off their meds, and it's just, the fantasy is fantastic. I love the fantasy.
Yeah. But what does it teach us? Is what you have to ask in all of this. What's it leading us towards? And I think that where we started is what's key to this section. Prayers of the saints mixed with the incense, but then is thrown into the thing and causes the earthquakes, and I believe causes all the woes that happen as well. It's that God is listening to those prayers and God reacts to those prayers. Now here's what's important about it. Prayers at its core, for me, conversation. So if God is speaking in some way, what is it asking of us?
What I hear is for us to take responsibility for what we have done,
For us to
For-
listen.
for the
Yes,
sins we have done, for us to take acknowledge and redemption.
for us to somehow be in that conversation with God and change, not be this last paragraph that I read twice. Right? To not be the ones who ignore whatever is going on. But to use that to change ourselves, to be part of what happens in the world. And if what we do is we turn this around and we fight just what God is doing, instead of changing the world. Right? So what you said about changing the world is exactly what it's calling us to. But how it does that is very different. It's not just you're fighting this evil in the world, it's that you're somehow hearing that you're praying and becoming the prayer that you pray. That you're that prayer is changing you, that conversation is moving in you, and it's making it so that you become something different in the midst of whatever happens.
You are the change that you want.
You are the change that you need. Right? And that's because God is at work that way through it, in you and through you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about changing the world, but about changing me, which may have some effect.
Yeah.
But it's about, for me, this is all about changing me and who I am and how I live.
And when somebody takes this and sees, oh, look at all that evil, and personifies it for you, and then looks at the bottomless pit and says that's hell and that's what's going to happen there. All of that is a way of being able to externalize evil. And the problem with the word evil is that we never see, when it comes right down to it, evil as our typical behaviors. It's always somebody else who's really evil.
You bet.
Right? And we can all name who he is, you know. Just
Yeah.
Okay, and it's really easy to point off towards somebody else as being evil. You know, my basic take on evil is that I think Jesus meant it as the typical everyday people that we are? And how do we rise to be the above average? Because the typical everyday people would do what John said here. We would just ignore it and go our merry way and say, but can we be changed by how God is moving? Do we listen to these things? Do we see these locusts and say, I gotta do something different? I gotta be something different. I have to act somehow different.
Jim?
Yes,
I've been sitting here thinking about this and I guess I sort of think that most sin always boils down to selfishness of some sort. And I would put this whole idea of what happens as a result of selfishness onto all of us and what we are currently doing to the environment of the earth. Now, I know that that is not what the Bible or Revelation was predicting, but it is certainly a way to look at that our selfishness has brought this upon us and it's a natural thing for it to have happened, and that God is working through nature for this, which is our 21st century way of looking at what God is doing.
but see, Pam, I think that's a valid way to be able to do this, because I don't think the writer of Revelation.
No,
is trying to say there's a certain type of thing that is wrong.
but if we're going to learn from this,
It's ways that we do things that hurt and we ignore, right? So destruction is happening because of climate change, for example. We have valid ways to be able to look, and are we hearing that, or are we going, yeah, I don't have.
and the way we treat some groups of people as well.
That's exactly right. You see that? Are you moved by it? Does your heart change because of that? Do you become the prayer that is mixed in with the incense and sent back to the earth?
I think the message is hard to hear in Revelation because we're not familiar with those images, which you've been trying to get through to us, that the people of those times would have been familiar with images from the way that they had been being taught. And so I think that it's helpful to hear this, but not get quite so wrapped up in the actual images as to what the images are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit different, Pam. I think you're right, but it's that we're too used to hearing a different interpretation of this book.
Yes.
We're too used to hearing how all of them are doing something evil in the world, and that's causing the destruction of a third of the rivers, and a third of the stars are dimmed, and a third of, and we think that's all them. We blame it on somebody external to us.
Well, why not?
Because the bottom line is, what I think the Revelator is saying is you have to accept that God is that God, what he's saying is, God is at work. Are you going to be part of God's work or not part of God's work?
Yeah,
Don't blame the other. Take on the responsibility yourself.
but if the other is clearly causing the problem, then it just seems like kind of a fantasy to say, oh, they're not a problem. No, it's not them,
That's not,
God.
yeah, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm sorry. If it sounds like that, that's not what I'm saying. Don't see them as evil, is what I'm saying. And I know, Melinda, when you talk about Republicans, sometimes it's hard for me not to hear evil in some of what they are and some of what they do. Right? And I know that they feel the same about me. But that's counterproductive to doing God's work. You have to fight what is the problem, not fight the person who is causing the problem. You see the difference?
Say that again.
Fight what is the problem, not fight the person who is causing it. That's why I think the 144,000 and the great multitude is important. Who ultimately ends up listening, and that's the piece that is just before this piece. That a countless multitude listen and follow. Can it be that person that you want to be against in this moment?
I can vote against them, though.
You can vote against it. That's exactly right. You vote and you build up the society that you need to have. You protest how somebody is misrepresenting things, but you protest the action, not the person.
But sometimes that's not hard for me, and other times it's really.
It is really difficult. Because it sure seems like it's them, not just the issues.
Well, it's them manifesting
I know,
the issue,
I
you
know,
know, and,
I know.
and I think that, that has to be addressed, you know.
Yeah, and that's the really difficult part about this. You do have to be face to face with people sometimes that are doing the opposite of what you want.
And isn't that where compassion comes in?
And that's what we have to figure out is have compassion, see still somehow God's people there, which we don't do easily, and they don't do easily, whoever's against us. And we oftentimes do come into that space and it's much easier to write off all those Muslims as bad people because they've opposed Christianity and to have God's side and not God's side. In whatever way we do that.
So it's compassion and passion, and how do you handle the passion?
Yeah.
And still have compassion.
Yeah. So you want to hear the next section? I'm gonna skip over a chapter. It's about a little scroll, and the scroll is about, it tastes sweet in your mouth, but when it gets to your stomach, it's made bitter.
Jim, tell me where you're going to start to read from.
I'm gonna do chapter 11, which is the two witnesses. Because this is the second half of this day. Not only do you have to lift prayers, you also have to lift voice.
Okay.
Okay, you have to say something. And I want you to hear what happens to you when you do. I'm gonna skip not just the first part. I'm gonna skip the first part and get to. No, I'll just read from the beginning of the chapter. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple, leave that out. For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. Remember that number, 42 months. And I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days. Remember that number, 1,260 days. You know how you can remember it? 42 months. Means the same
And,
thing.
and those are 30-day months, not 31.
Yeah.
You do-
42 months, 1,260 days, same thing, same number. Okay, they'll prophesy wearing sackcloth. When they finish their testimony, skip down to verse 7. The beast that comes from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days,
Have as much as you want and cost the rest.
it means the very same as 42 months and 1,260 days. That's why you know. For 3.5 days, members of the tribes, of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet. And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. Oh. all of those things about 3.5 days, 42 months. You know what, 42 months and 3.5 days mean the same thing.
Why?
Hours?
42 months is 3.5 years. And so in the book of Daniel, he uses that numerology a lot. Okay? And this is what he says. He says, time, times, and half a time. Time, times, half a time, 3.5. Got it? What's that mean? This is how long it really is. That really difficult time you're going through, this is how long it really is. This is what it feels like to you. This is what it feels like to God. This is short time. It's a short time. It feels like a really long time. Okay? It's also 3.5 is half the number of what?
7.
Half the number of God. Right? And so whatever it feels like, it's nowhere close to what is true. So every time you hear that, whether it's in Daniel or it's in Revelation, it's saying it is nowhere close to what is true. The witnesses are laying there for 3.5 days. It feels like all it is just the death that happens to them, and it's not true. And how many of you have gone through the death of someone beloved to you, somebody who was a witness to you, who spoke truth to you, and it felt like forever that their voice was gone. But somewhere down the road, you discovered it again. And it was just 3.5 days, not little, but just a small amount of time compared to the whole of what could be true. You have to open yourself up to a larger truth than what feels like it in that moment. Whoever your witness is, whatever seems to have been shut down. How many have had some dream of yours destroyed by somebody else's works? My first year that I was here was the year that in November of that year, we sat in that room and we cried together. I, as a certain person, was elected. Was elected. And we mourned together. And our 3.5 days, our 42 months, our 1,260 days is not over. We're still in the middle of trying to figure out this time of tribulation, this time of trial, this time of not understanding it. And it feels, and this is what's really important about this, is that we should understand what he's trying to tell us really easily, because we're trying to find meaning. We're trying to find spiritual meaning, and how do we take the next step meaning in the midst of this kind of time? We're trying to figure out in the midst of tribulation, how do you still find God? How do you still find meaning? And sometimes it's just not easily there. So you just take a step. And truthfully, sometimes it means that all of a sudden you feel like you're laying out in the middle of the city square, dead. Your voice has been cut off completely. Silenced. Times and half a time. It doesn't last forever. It's only a fraction of the perfect. It's only a fraction of the God. Keep being that witness. Keep doing that work.
So there was a Facebook thing that really struck me because they were talking about people who were born in the turn of the century, of the 1900s, and what they went through, the flu that killed so many people, the World War I that was supposed to end all wars, the Depression, the Second World War, Korea, you know, maybe not all of those, but that accumulation that just struck me as we think we've got it bad. It's never been easy. And the other thing that I've just recently come to is that there are lessons to be learned from the MAGA people. For me, that vigilance about the polling places, in my view, they're going at it aggressively and maybe even violently in ways that I don't like. But the lesson is, we all need to stay vigilant about the voting process. If we just shrug our shoulders and say, it's gonna be fine, without any supervision or any input from us, we're headed down the wrong road. So, you know, it's not that I like what they're doing, but I need to learn from what they're doing. Then I also need to pay attention to how the voting process works. But those are just so tiny, I mean, that's less than 3.5 days, but I tell myself, those little incremental changes in my thinking are worth the effort.
But part of why this is such huge images. But a third of the rivers are turned bitter, is so that you know it could be so much worse. So you know there's huge things you're not facing. So keep being faithful in the midst of it. Keep doing what you can in the midst of it. Right? Your body's not lying out on the city square for 3.5 days. Make sure that you don't get to a place where that's what happens. Work to change things now. Work to be the witness of something that needs to be. And that means that you have to do some of the hard things like talk to your MAGA neighbor rather than just shooting. You know, which you might want to do at some point. You might want to do it too, right? But how do we sit in that space of a better way of God, a better way of being than that? There's not simple answers. But hold that which you're facing, like you said, in perspective of what all else could be. That's not going to solve the issue for you. You're still going to have to go through whatever it is you're going through. And it will be trial. One of the worst things that happens with this particular type of passage is your left behind loving friends interpret this in a certain way. They say there's going to be a rapture. All the good people will be taken away, and then there will be 7 years of tribulation. And they put it into a historical moment rather than seeing it in the creative, imaginative, every moment space. And it's not meant to describe a particular space, but that's easier. And why is that easier? Because if I'm going to be raptured up anyway, then I don't have to face it at all. Only you guys who are evil and bad and it's that are left behind. And so it's a way of being able to escape theologically. And that's not the point here. You don't get to escape. Problems are going to be there. You're going to face difficulties. You're going to face opposition, right? And you have to figure out what to do with it. Don.
Well, I think I could start a whole new church using the Revelations. So there's all kinds of possibilities of what I could reveal from this book and Bible. Just really crazy stuff.
And people have done that a lot.
And they're out there.
That's right.
And there's
It's an easy one to use to say, I have the only right definition and you have to follow me.
and I know I have this connection with God. God's told me, but I should interpret this. And it's just crazier than hell.
Yeah, yeah, It is,
Self-protection.
And you're kind of on the edge of this, you know?
but here's why we're doing this. It's
Yeah.
Because you've got to stop letting them have the only right interpretation of this book.
That's right.
Because right now, one of the biggest reasons why we are sitting in some of the spaces that we're in is because people are saying, I gotta hurry along this time of tribulation. I gotta make it so that this happens. And they are excusing behavior that is anything but faithful in the name of faithfulness.
And I know people that are working on trying to bring this to fruition.
Yeah.
And they've gone to the Middle East, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It's incredible, it's amazing.
Yeah, and we have got to start telling a different story about this book. Okay, part of the reason why this is happening now is because the book that I mentioned a while ago, Left Behind, that series, 12 books, was enormous in Christian circles. And it told absolutely the wrong interpretation of this book.
Well, if you're gonna rewrite the Bible, you know, how are you gonna get people to have a better interpretation? Because, you know, if you read it, it sounds exactly like those people's interpretation. So what's the point of having it rather than just
Because you
writing
have
a
to,
new story?
you have to be the messengers, the witnesses that sit in that square and speak up about this, to say a different story,
Right, but
okay? But wait, let me finish. Barbara Rossian, who wrote an amazing book called The Rapture Exposed, says, why do evangelical readers love Revelation so much? And then she quoted it again. He said, it brings the Bible alive. Brings the Bible alive, and I think it does. But she says, she adds to it, but it also then appends to that bringing alive a certain violent and fear-based theology that turns it in a whole different direction than what it's meant to be. It is not supposed to be violent or fear-based, but another author, Yekizel Landau, said this, that many of the people who believe this book believe that it says something like this instead of John 3:16. For God so loved the earth that he sent World War III.
yeah, exactly.
That's right.
And that's why I'm teaching this, is because if that's the conclusion that is usually being drawn out of this book, then that is not speaking what this book is talking about. And we have got to start speaking a different message than that message, which is too widespread. This still is a book like John 3 that is saying about what love is, not what about how I can hate all my enemies. And I can kill all my enemies. And that picking up a gun is an act of God. And that's how it's getting interpreted a lot right now. And it's being used for justification of all kinds of horrible things, and we've got to preach a better gospel than that.
It's a belief that God wrote the Bible.
Well, but that God wrote certain things in the Bible. I think you can believe that God wrote the Bible. I don't particularly in the same way many people say that. I think God inspired the people who wrote. But when you say that, that means that certain doctrines, certain actions are okay, right? When it essentially gives me permission to, because Doris says a certain thing, she said God's going to rain down hell upon me. Right?
Right out of your mouth, Doris.
That's where it becomes wrong. That's where we move from this being a book that is inspired by God to this being a book that is coming from a whole different other place.
Jim?
So,
Hold on just a second, Pam.
Okay,
what if you were just to interpret the whole thing as a drama inside the individual self?
And that we all have this, kind of, story, because all of us know that we are heading towards our own personal, ending.
Yeah.
And that we have these tremendously conflicting aspects of our psyche. And, some of which are extremely violent.
Yeah.
And that the message then would be that there is in fact urgency. There is an urgency to take the right stance, but that it's, I mean, it's a little bit like what you're saying, it's your personal responsibility, but it's not necessarily about what might be happening out there in the world, although there are many reflections of it, but it's really having to do with recognizing parts of the psyche, including the incredibly dark and violent aspects.
And we recognize that really good in the other person.
Yes.
Right,
And much of this is about recognizing that here.
yeah,
And working on this and working towards what is the right. What is that which. When I say the divine, what is the divine calling me to? Not what something else is calling me to.
but you could also say that for John himself. That he might not have been conscious of it.
Yeah.
So that there's a certain amount of projection going on there. That actually have to do with just violent end elements in this.
Yeah, exactly right.
Mhm.
So this is, oh, Pam, you were gonna say something.
I was just going to ask you, what is worse? Someone who believes things are in the Bible, which aren't really there, or who misinterprets things that are in the Bible.
So I think what's worse is when we get caught up in just what I want. Just the selfish space of just me. However, we get to that space, instead of seeing it in the more corporate sense. Bible almost entirely from first to last is talking about community.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
Unity. Right, relationship. And how are we in those relationships? This particular path, this particular place is about saying, well, they're evil, so I can do whatever I want to. Or are we going to listen and say, that's not how we get to interpret it?
But so many people are wrapped up in salvation rather than community.
Yeah, I'm saved and you obviously don't want to. And so I can do whatever I want to with you.
To hell with you.
To hell with you. Literally, right? And,
Not the pit.
and somehow we have to be bold in being able to speak a different way of speaking it. And you're missing the meal. We're 5 minutes late.
Yeah.
So I know that we have not solved this. We got some other chapters. We got some other chapters that you're gonna have to go through before you get it solved.
Let's forget the potluck and keep going.
It's good, isn't it? It's worth it. So sorry that we haven't solved it all, but John's not we're done with showing us the worst.
Worse.
You haven't even got to the dragon. We just barely touched on the first beast, and we got the second beast to go, along with the great and abominable horror. All right, you guys, see ya.
Bye-bye.
We got the handout, but.